Hello and welcome to Read All About It, the podcast where people talk about their favourite and not so favourite books. Join me, Paul Cuddihy, as I take each guest on the literary journey of their life, from their most cherished childhood read and a book they'd recommend to anyone, to the book they couldn't be paid to read again, and much more in between. So listen, enjoy, subscribe and spread the word about the Read All About It podcast. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Read All About It podcast, and I'm delighted to be joined by the writer Iain Maloney. Now, Iain is an editor and he lectures on writing in Japan. He has degrees in English from Aberdeen University and creative writing from Glasgow University, and he's also published 3 novels: The Waves Burn Bright, Silma Hill and First Time Solo. He also reviews regularly for a number of publications, including the Japan Times. He moved from Scotland in 2005 and lives in Japan with his wife Minori. And in March 2020 he's published a new book, The Only Gaijin in the Village, with Polygon, and that charts a year of his life living in rural Japan. Iain, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Paul.
And obviously people will be able to tell right away that you're actually not in Japan at the moment,
No.
but you're over on a book tour, and your current stop is Glasgow for the I Write Festival.
Yeah, that's on tonight as we record. I'm over for the whole of March. Virus is willing, and I'll be around. Travelling around, promoting the book and getting rained on.
Now, obviously the book, it does chart your year of living in rural Japan. You've stayed in the country for a number of years, but you obviously moved away from the urban centre to a more rural centre. But it's interesting when you read the book, and I was lucky enough, you were kind enough to send me a copy of the book, and it's interesting, I'm guessing, when they say home is where the heart is, and home for you now is Japan, and that really comes across in the book.
Yeah, Japan's my home now. It's where I live. It doesn't make my mother too happy when I say I'm going home now and mean Japan. But Scotland's still home as well. I think it's possible to have more than one home. So yeah. Aberdeen is my home, and Gifu in Japan is my home. And
I think that kind of comes across in the book as well. The fact that you almost like not quite dual nationality, but the idea that you can have that kind of identity as a Scot in Japan, or like you feel Japanese or part of that country and that culture, but obviously you're still a pool of Scotland as well.
Yeah, it's not, I don't think home is a sort of geographic thing. It's more, where the heart is. It's more Aberdeen's where my memories are, it's where my parents live, and Japan is where I feel comfortable, it's where I've settled down, it's where I've bought a house and made a home. So yeah, it's kind of a nice split. It's nice having the duality and being able to experience. Well, I think we're lucky enough to live in a time where air travel's so cheap and easy, even if it does damage the environment, that kind of lifestyle is possible now.
I think as well, when people read the book, it's kind of very visual, and people you paint a really good picture of, particularly when you're sitting outside with a beer in front of your fire outside, and you just have, I always had this vision of just this beautiful view that you can just sit and appreciate, and it's maybe your life's taking this unexpected turn that you never, when you were in Aberdeen, never thinking this is where I'm going to end up and settle. Yeah,
I certainly never thought I'd settle there. When I was younger, I didn't watch Japanese movies or read manga or watch anime or anything like that. I just sort of went out with the intention of staying for a year and travelling afterwards, and then fell in love with the country, fell in love with the girl, and that was that. Stayed there. But yeah, my fire pit is probably the best part of it. Just sitting there with a view over the rice fields and having a beer.
And there is a really nice bit in the book as well where I think it's your first fire of the year, and you're outside and it's cold. Your wife's inside because it's freezing.
Yeah.
And so you're quite enjoying it, and then some of your neighbours just suddenly, it's very cinematic actually, where you just say they just appear, and then there's this kind of community of everybody, the guys just sitting around having a beer around this fire, and I think that's so nice.
Yeah, there's that curiosity of what's this weird foreigner doing sitting in the snow, let's go over and check it out, and then because the fire's going, it's not actually that cold, and it's just nice. Everybody there's been very welcoming and very friendly, and my Japanese is good enough that we can sit around and have a chat and things like that. It's not great, I'm not perfect, but it's good enough for that.
No doubt in the course of this conversation we'll talk about the book as well as your other novels as well, but obviously I'm taking you back on your own literary journey, and if we go right back to childhood, and interesting when you give me the choice of your favourite book from childhood, when you actually sent me the list in brackets, it was yes, really. So yes. you can tell everybody what you chose.
Yeah, I chose strangely for my childhood book, Spike Milligan's Mussolini: His Part in My Downfall, which is the fourth part of his war diaries. It took me a long time to work out which one to choose. It's a difficult question, that one, favourite book from childhood, because how do you define childhood? Mm-hmm. You know, there's books I remember reading when I was very young, Roald Dahl and Dick King-Smith and those kind of writers. And I remember them, Roald Dahl in particular, being very important to me. But I don't really have much memory of actually reading the books and the stories and things like that. It's more just the nostalgia of the cover. Like my niece is about 1.5 just now, and thinking about Christmas and birthdays, what books to buy her, and just looking at the covers and going, oh, I used to love that one. But beyond that, I wouldn't have much to say about those books. But I found Spike Milligan's book on my parents' bookshelves when I was about 10 or 11, that kind of age. So we had a lot of books in the house. Other guests on this podcast have spoken about this as well, having lots of books and having parents who are not censoring what they read and that kind of thing. Just pull something off the shelf and read it. So they were like that with books. They were also like that with my dad's record collection. Pull stuff off and put it on, and he had Led Zeppelin records and things like that. So I would just do that, pull stuff off and find things that I found, like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Lord of the Rings and those kind of books. But yeah, I pulled Spike Milligan off the shelf, and I don't know to this day actually why they only had the fourth one in the series.
That was I was wondering why out of all those 7 that you chose.
Yeah, that one, it was the first one I read, and I'd never heard of him. I didn't know about the Goons, and I hadn't come across his poetry or anything like that. It was just I pulled it off, and it was a paperback edition with a funny cartoon of like a caricature Spike with a bowl of spaghetti upside down on his head.
Right.
And I was like, that's funny. It's an interesting cover, and started to read it, and I've sort of never stopped reading it since. I reread it. Well, I reread the whole series quite frequently. It's just, first of all, it's just hilarious. It's a very, very funny book. He's the comedian that inspired most of the other comedians of the 20th century, inspired Monty Python and all those people. And some of it hasn't dated well, it has to be said. He's very much of his generation, but the comedy, the humour there just really tickled me. It probably shaped a lot of my humour, but it also was just on the right level for me. A lot of Spike's humour is quite childish. So
because I liked when I was just checking, and there was a list of all 7 books, and then when it came to the 4th one, Mussolini: His Part in My Downfall, and it says this was announced as the 4th part of his quote increasingly misnamed trilogy. Yeah. So that kind of right away that tells you. Yeah,
it's that kind of attitude, and it's an interesting series because it was dismissed at the time of publication as being kind of I think Clive James called it an unreliable history of the war. So it's all about his time as a soldier, as a gunner in the Royal Artillery during the Second World War and after. And yeah, it was sort of dismissed as not being reliable, as him taking liberties with the truth for entertainment, which he probably did. The conversations are very much like scripts from the Goon Show rather than natural conversations. But it was all about his experiences. And interestingly, I was just listening to another podcast, We Have Ways of Making You Talk, which is Al Murray's podcast on the Second World War, and he was talking about the book as being actually a very reliable history of what it was like being a soldier fighting in North Africa and in Italy during the Second World War.
Surely if it's your memoir, I mean, it's not by its very nature, it's not a definitive history, it's your experience of any particular, in this case, the Second World War.
Yeah, I think it's kind of something I struggled with a bit when I was writing my memoir as well, is how far can you go in shaping the stories and turn them, basically my book is, a lot of it is a collection of anecdotes I've been telling people in pubs and things over the years, and anecdotes are necessarily structured to make people laugh at the end usually, or make them cry, or whatever it might be. And it's a sort of sliding scale between this, this is just the cold hard facts, which can be a bit boring, so we shape it a bit to make it more interesting. And I think with Spike sometimes he did get a bit carried away with the shaping and go, I can make this better, I can make it funnier. And it's, as you say, I wrote 3 novels before doing this one. I was a fiction writer first, and that part of the brain is always on when I was doing the memoir of, I could take this and this, and that would make a great plot. And
the thing is, if your memoir, if it's not you, if your personality doesn't come out of it, or people when they're reading it don't get to know a wee bit about you or your wife or where you're staying or the characters in it, they're not going to read it.
Yeah,
you have to structure it in a way that you're giving a wee bit of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Nobody would want to read either just a diary of today I did this, or a sort of cold factual account of I moved to Japan and that kind of story. So yeah, there's that aspect of it which has always, I guess, shaped how I approached this book. The other interesting thing that has stuck with me from Mussolini, from that particular book, is so the series starts off with Hitler, my part in his downfall. So it's how Spike fought Hitler, grandiose, hyperbolic claim. And Mussolini is his part in my downfall, because Spike was wounded in Italy. He got, I think, a mortar exploded quite near him, and he got what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. At that time, in his words, he was bomb happy. That's how he called it. So he was injured, and he writes very movingly, very eloquently about what it feels like to have post-traumatic stress disorder. About he would just start crying uncontrollably and not even really know why. And at that time and in that situation, being in the army in Italy, in the middle of, it was the Monte Cassino battle, one of the biggest battles of the war. A man in uniform just suddenly starting to cry doesn't go down very well. So he was sort of invalided out. So Spike's kind of got this reputation as just being stupid, surreal comedy, kind of silly stuff. But that book in particular is very moving, very beautifully written, and was a big kind of behind the scenes influence. My third novel was about post-traumatic stress disorder. So I guess early on in my reading, that idea was planted in there. Because
you mentioned, as you say, like some of the other guests living in a house full of books, but more than that, just the fact that what your parents were doing was encouraging curiosity, and that nothing was off limits, that actually it was up to you to then go and investigate. So it all probably makes you a more curious and a more rounded reader, which is maybe they weren't consciously thinking that at the time, but actually that's what ends up happening.
Yeah, I mean they would push their own favourite things. My dad was a big Lord of the Rings fan, so read that, but yeah, there was certainly none of it in a negative way of, don't read that, that's too old for you. Yeah, you're right, it's just curiosity of, I listened to the episode of this with Willie Maley, where he was talking about just that idea of just open a book, read it. Like, you can't have an opinion on a book or on a genre or on a writer until you've read it.
Yeah.
And it's that curiosity, that starts early. If you just leave things around, kids will eventually get bored and go, what's this?
If we take you on then from Spike Milligan, your next step forward then is more teenage formative years, and it's an Ian Banks novel that you've chosen.
It is, yeah. Complicity, which is the first one of his I read when I was trying to work it out today on the way here, I would have been about 14, I think, when I came across it. And I can remember the moment. I'd never heard of Ian Banks, and I didn't read that widely of Scottish writers at all at that time. I had an audiobook. It's funny, a lot of these episodes people mention Robert Louis Stevenson early on, and I had a kid's abridged audiobook of Treasure Island. Right. So that was a big thing. But because I was just pulling things off shelves and then going to the library as well, we'd go every weekend, it never really occurred to me to think about where writers were from. I'm reading an American writer or a Scottish writer. But when I was around 14, I guess I was becoming more aware of the world and more sort of politically aware as well. And I was really into a heavy metal band from Glasgow called The Almighty, which were pretty big at the time, and they were a fantastic band. Sadly no longer around. They've pretty much been forgotten. But in 1994 they released an album called Crank that was quite political. It was like punk, heavy metal, and very political songs. And it was around the time, this is going back, but it was around the time of the Criminal Justice Act, and there was protests about that, and they were part of it. They had all their artwork for singles and things were like, stop this, stop this bill that was mainly to stop young people congregating and having raves and things like that. So I was listening to that album and reading interviews with them, and in one of the interviews where they were talking about their own politics and their own kind of political awakening, the singer Ricky Warwick said that one of his favourite books was Complicity by Iain Banks. And I was like, oh, I've never heard of that guy. I'm going, this is my favourite band, that's their favourite author, I'll go and check this out. So I went and got it, and yeah, it's a fantastic book. Probably Banks's most overtly political, and he was quite a political writer. And that was me hooked on it. It was the first one by them, devoured everything he wrote.
I like that idea that, like obviously you see your parents might have recommended books or friends, but just the fact that it's someone who in a different genre, in a different kind of art form, you admire or you're a fan, so you think, well, that leap, I like them. Well, if they like him, then so must I. So it's good when that happens. Yeah, it's all the crossover. It's I never understand people that like, I only like film or I only like music and that's my thing. It's they all feed into each other. Absolutely, yeah. You learn about bands from watching a film and hearing a song on the soundtrack and what's that? And investigating it. And now you get writers write about their favourite bands as well. So Ian Rankin will mention Mogwai or Belle and Sebastian or whoever in one of his Rebus novels, and people find bands that way. And yeah, for me it was finding Iain Banks through the Almighty. And if they're listening, then I'm sure that you would love nothing better than for them to reform as well. Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think they're all, certainly Ricky Warwick's still playing in bands and that kind of thing. But yeah, Complicity is just an amazing book. It's often very difficult to write about politics and the kind of politics that make you angry. And Banks was quite an angry man when it came to politics. He famously burnt his passport and sent it to Number 10 when Blair was Prime Minister in protest at the Iraq War. Right. And he wrote in his book Raw Spirit, he's supposed to be travelling around Scotland visiting whiskey distilleries, and it's just peppered with rants about the Blair government and the Iraq War. And it's often very hard to turn that into convincing fiction, a good story, because the soapbox stuff kind of gets in the way of a good plot or a good character. But with Complicity, it's so brilliantly built into the plot that it's a sort of murder mystery of an ex-soldier getting revenge on people who've kind of, try to think of a way to do it without spoiling the story, but yeah, kind of getting revenge on people who have put soldiers' lives in danger, or that kind of thing, arms manufacturers and government people, that kind of thing. And it's a fantastic book, just for characterisation and plot. But it also taught me a lot. I didn't realise this until later, but that book and Iain Banks generally taught me a lot about writing and about technique. Whenever a murder happens in the book, it switches into second person. You go into the house, you go up the stairs, and it's a really powerful technique that can be a bit overused. But that was the first time I sort of came across it. So Complicity by Iain Banks is recommended by Iain Maloney and the Almighty. Yeah. You mentioned there, just in terms of writing, that you've becoming aware of a sense of a writer's identity, and just given what we started talking about in terms of where you see your home now, and is that something that you wouldn't want to identify as a Scottish writer, or are you just a writer in a kind of global sense? I'm definitely a Scottish writer. There's a lot in my writing and in my voice that is Scottish, but I think that can be a positive thing. It's not used to, only Scottish people can read me, not that kind of thing. Hopefully my writing is also universal, as all writing should be. Yeah, those labels, they can be problematic. I mean, when you talk about like women writers or women's fiction, stuff like that, it can be used to categorise people and sort of shunt them to one side a bit. So that kind of using identity as a way of categorising writers can be problematic. But because it was interesting because obviously some people might be aware of the Waves Burn Bright, for example, which was about a novel based on the Piper Alpha disaster. But then even the other, like when I was looking at Selma Hill, it was just one comparison. It's compared to some classic Scottish literature. So James Hogg, Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, George Douglas Brown, The House with Green Shutters, James Kelman, How Late It Was, How Late. Which again, if you're reading that as a writer, you must be thinking, my goodness, I've done something right here.
Yeah, you know, if your name's mentioned, even just by one person in with that company, it's flattering, it's humbling, it's wonderful. I've always found that I write a lot of reviews, and I try to avoid that comparison thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this writer's like this writer is like this writer, because no writer is like any other writer. It's what you were saying before about voice and memoirs and your personality. Even if you're writing crime fiction or science fiction or whatever, the writer's personality and voice will come through, so everything's different. But it's often a nice shorthand to say, if you like, people who liked this book also liked.
Yeah, as long as it doesn't put pressure on a writer, because I always think, for example, sometimes in a football context, if a young player comes through, the worst thing the MD can do is say he's the new Kenny Dalglish, he's the new Messi or whoever, and you think just let him be the new himself. And I think sometimes with writers as well, as long as you don't go, I'm never going to live up to those expectations, but I'll take it in the positive manner.
Yeah, nobody's ever going to be the new James Kelman. It's this James Kelman.
Exactly.
So, but yeah, you can. I'm happy just being Iain Maloney.
Yeah,
doing that.
That's fair enough. I mean, with 3 novels and a memoir behind you already, that's at some point. What I think you really want, you've made it when at some point you read a review and somebody go, he's the new Iain Maloney.
Yeah, that hasn't happened yet, but fingers crossed.
You never know. You are listening to the Read All About It podcast with me, Paul Cuddy, and my guest is the writer Iain Maloney. And Iain, we're on to question 3, and that's a book that you'd recommend to anyone.
Yeah, this is, as some of your previous guests have pointed out, this is a difficult question, because how do you define, is it a book that anyone would read, or just a book that you absolutely love and think they should share? It took me a long time to decide on something. So I love David Mitchell, I love Ali Smith. They're probably my 2 favourite writers. So I'd say to anyone, read all of David Mitchell's books, read all of Ali Smith's books. But they don't need me recommending them. People who read know who they are. They're big name writers. They have big publishing companies with big marketing budgets to promote their books. So I picked a book called Belka, Why Don't You Bark by Furukawa Hideo, the Japanese writer. And I picked it firstly because it's amazing. It's just a fantastic book. But also it's not very widely known. I read a lot of Japanese literature, and I write about a lot of Japanese literature for a few outlets, including the Japan Times. And it's kind of a shame that Japanese literature is famous, and people read a lot of Japanese authors, but always within quite a narrow category. There's the Murakami Haruki and Yoshimoto Banana, and these kind of writers break through, but there's a whole literature there that really doesn't get noticed, and it's difficult for writers, like we were just saying about the new James Kelman ever. Japanese writers, when they get translated into English, it's always the new Haruki Murakami or the new Banana Yoshimoto, if they're Roman. They've got to be quirky, they've got to be weird, little bits of supernatural stuff, that kind of thing. And that's just one very narrow aspect of it. It's like if Scottish literature was only translated into Japanese, they only translated crime novels and nothing else. So I want to just big up this book and say, it's out there, everybody should read it. If I were a betting man, which I'm not, I would put money on Hideo Furukawa winning the Nobel one day. He's that good, he's that amazing. He reminds me a bit, completely contradicting what I just said about not comparing writers, but he reminds me a bit of Don DeLillo. He's got that kind of scope, but with an amazing writing style and an amazing sense of humour. And
is that one of the many benefits for you of living in Japan now, that you're discovering literature that probably, as you say, if you were still over here, you would be oblivious to?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when I first moved out there, because I knew nothing about Japan when I left Scotland, I started reading histories and culture books and literature, and I read Murakami and these kind of people, and then just kept getting deeper and deeper into it. And then one of the joys of reviewing is that once your name's out there, publishers start sending you stuff and you get the free books in advance. And
which
then,
for any readers
it's the best
great
thing. I will never get bored of a free book landing on my doorstep, although there's often the ebooks now, which is, it's still nice to have them, but it's still
physical ones better.
Yeah, you want that. Yeah, and this one, Belka, it's a very, very strange concept for a book. So it starts with Laika, who was the Russian dog that was sent into space. He was certainly the first dog in space and went up before people. I can't remember if he was the first animal at all. But Laika didn't come back. They sent him up in one of the Sputniks. He orbited the Earth and died up there. Then they sent up two other dogs, Belka and Strelka, and they came back. They were the first creatures to successfully orbit the Earth and then land again and come back. So Furukawa takes that as kind of the start point of the novel, of these two space dogs that then breed. They have children and they mix with other sort of impressive dogs around the world. And this part of this is true, that one of the puppies produced by Belka, I think, was presented to JFK by Khrushchev during that period. So these puppies were, they were the pride of Russia at the time, pride of the Soviet Union. So the book kind of follows the descendants of these dogs as they spread around the Earth.
So the dogs are the main characters, or are there human characters?
There are human characters as well. So there's a parallel story set in Russia, but involving kind of Japanese Yakuza and a little girl who's the daughter of a Yakuza boss that ends up through various twists in the middle of, I think it's Siberia, but somewhere in the sort of the wastes of Russia. But yeah, the dogs are kind of equal characters with the humans, and it's brilliantly done, because there's quite a few novels have been done with animals as the main characters, but they're usually kind of either satires on, Virginia Woolf's Flush is looking at humans through the eyes of a dog and going, oh, well, aren't we silly when we look at ourselves from outside, or just kind of cute and a bit twee and just, oh, isn't it funny to see what's going on inside an animal's head. Whereas Furukawa treats them with deep respect and has them as sentient and as clever and as deep and multifaceted as any other human character. And it's fascinating. It's a brilliant book. It's very weird. It's a very unusual way of telling the story, but it's absolutely gripping all the way through, and can't recommend it highly enough.
Because I've probably said it in every podcast actually, that one of the real benefits, it's a kind of benefit and not quite a curse, but it's, or burden. The benefit is getting all these great recommendations, but then the burden is I've got to read them all, and it's a never-ending pile.
Yeah. But
again, particularly, like if somebody like yourself can bring a book, not just to me but to everybody who's listening, as you already touched on, that most of us, if not all of us, won't have heard of either the author or the book. That's a brilliant way of spreading the word, and as you say, maybe just spreading what you've got from that book to other people.
Yeah, and it's also, because it's literature in translation, if people buy it, they'll translate more of his books and get more out there. He's prolific in Japanese, but there's only 3 of his books have ever been translated, and I'm desperate for more, and other people should be. So, it's criminal how few books are translated into English every year. It's like 2% of the total, something like that. So yeah, more.
So that's Belka, Why Don't You Bark? And how would you say the name? Because sometimes when you print it, I think the surname or the second name.
Yeah, so in Japan they put the surname first, the family name first, and the given name second. And it's often been the convention for us to switch it. But the government's been discussing this recently, and they're sort of keen to keep names in the Japanese order. So instead of referring to the Prime Minister as Shinzo Abe, as we would have done in the news, they would like us to refer to him as Abe Shinzo, which seems eminently sensible to me. So
hopefully
that way.
Hopefully a few more people will read Belka, Why Don't You Bark? Yeah. Certainly, as you say, it sounds like a completely weird or unusual concept for a novel.
It's very hard, as maybe it's come across, it's very hard to describe what it's about and what happens. You kind of have to just read it and experience it.
But that's the thing, as I say, people who are listening to this are generally interested in reading anyway, so it just provokes that curiosity. And I often think whether it's a name you don't know, or sometimes maybe somebody's written a book that's completely different from what you're used to, you just want to go, well, I want to go and see what that's all about, because if somebody like yourself is raving about it, you think, right, well, let's go and have a wee see what the chat's about.
Yeah, it's a great thing about this podcast. Like I've never read, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, Don Quixote.
Well, Chris Dolan, he gave me the Spanish and the English. So.
Yeah, I can't remember, but yeah, I've never read it and I've always put it off. But then Chris was so evangelical about it. I was like, right.
Well, I can say I read.
Get around to it. So.
He told me because it's 2 books together because he wrote the first part and then he only wrote the second part because someone had almost written a spoof. Yeah. So I've read the first book and it is as good as Chris says. So I would certainly recommend that.
Yeah, that's me for the flight back to Japan.
Excellent. Yeah. I always like this point in the podcast where we go from a book where you're evangelical about to a book that you couldn't be paid to read again.
Yeah, this was the easiest one.
Not everybody says that. Actually.
Yeah, I could see how it would be difficult, but for me, this was just, it took less than a second to decide.
It must have had a really bad effect on you then.
It really did. Dr. Sachs by Jack Kerouac is my one. I loved Kerouac when I was younger. I very much fall into that sort of cliched. When I was a teenager, I read On the Road and it blew my mind, and then I became obsessed with the Beats and Ginsberg and Burroughs and all of that stuff. And books like Dharma Bums and Desolation Angels, the Kerouac books where he goes into solitude, I've always liked, where he goes up the mountains or goes into the forest. I tried to read On the Road again recently, and that didn't go well. It hasn't. I think it's very much a young person's, or maybe just a young man's book. But Dr. Sachs I read when I was at university, and I was very much in that I love the beats period. And it's 118 pages, and it took me 6 months to finish because I couldn't read more than a page or two at a time before throwing it across the room.
But you persevered.
I persevered. At that time, I still very much believed in you have to finish a book.
Yeah.
If you start a book, you have to finish a book. I don't buy into that now because life's too short and there's too many books. But I persevered. And I'm kind of glad I did, because now I can really rant about how bad it is knowing every single page of it. It's an awful book. Very little happens. Kind of Jack Kerouac looking back at his own childhood and trying to turn some of his memories into a novel. So a lot of it is about I guess he wasn't a very popular child or didn't have many friends and spent a lot of time alone in his room playing these. He invented like baseball and horse racing games, I think like card games and stuff like that. And they're thoroughly dull. He describes in great detail these invented games that don't make any sense, and that even if you were to play them probably wouldn't be much fun, but just having someone else describe them to you are tedious. And then there's a whole thing where he fantasises about comic book characters and stuff like that. And it's basically just, I think by this point Kerouac had bought into his own myth. That story of how he wrote On the Road in 3 weeks, just taking Benzedrine and coffee and wine and just typing, isn't really true. It's pretty much been debunked that he prepared everything. He did do the typing, and you can go and see the roll of paper in a museum. But he'd prepared and made notes and knew exactly what he was going to write. And then he spent time afterwards editing and rewriting and redrafting. But he sort of developed this myth about the stream of consciousness, and just writing On the Road just flowed out of me as if dictated by the muse. And people loved that, people bought into it. But I think by the time he got round to Dr. Sachs, he was a bit worse for wear with the drink that would...
Yeah, because I read a quote, I can't remember who it was he had written to about that, but I don't know if I think he basically wrote it when he was on drugs, so... Yeah. Which again, I've never read it, so I'm guessing maybe that was maybe part of the problem.
Yeah, certainly his critical faculties probably weren't firing on all cylinders. And yeah, you can tell he's just going, whatever I write will be gold. And it's really, really not. It's so bad. He could not get me to read that again.
That is unequivocal then. Which I'm glad, because I say some people are either reluctant to pick a book that they for a whole variety of reasons, but I'm quite glad that you've nailed your colours to that
one. I have since read books that I've never finished.
Yeah.
I've been like, I'm not enjoying this, I don't like this, and stopped. But nothing that has kind of stayed with me as traumatically as Dr. Sachs has.
I mean, in terms of, again, we spoke earlier on about your own writing. You've written 3 novels and now a memoir. Are you looking to go back in terms of going back to writing another novel, or is it just something, you're always writing something and just see what emerges?
Yeah, I've always got a few things on the go. Part of what dictates what will come next is partly it's just the kind of market, the publishing industry and what happens. So just now literary fiction isn't selling very well. Crime fiction's massive, but literary fiction isn't. So publishers are reluctant to take on literary fiction. So I could write a literary novel that is great, but then lots of publishers would just knock it back on business grounds, which is fair enough. It is a business. And if this book, it's too early to tell, but if this book is in any way successful, then there might be more interest in another book about Japan or more travel writing, that kind of thing. But I'm working on a science fiction novel just now, which I'd love to get published, and I'm working on a travel book about America, and I've kind of got all these things on the go at one time, and eventually at some point either I'll decide or circumstances will decide, right, this is the one to pursue next.
I quite like that idea, that because it means you're not pigeonholed, because obviously you've got novels, but particularly completely different subjects. You've now got that, a memoir. You say you're maybe going into science fiction, so it's quite good for you as a writer that people don't know what to expect next, but it doesn't constrain you then.
It does. It's great for me. I've always loved it, and I'm not sure why it doesn't happen more. It happens in film. You get somebody like Tarantino will do like a crime film and then a western and then a samurai film and then mix it all together. But publishers and readers tend to want writers to stay with one thing, because then you build up a readership. People who love crime novels, for example, will keep reading Ian Rankin because they know what they're getting. Whereas I've had people, in fact, I've had good friends say they love one of my books, but they can't stand one of the other ones because they don't like that genre. I love the Waves Burn Bright.
They'd have to be really good friends to say that, wouldn't
they? Or really bad friends. One or the other. But,
or ex-friends.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, for me it's just, I can only write what I'm interested in, and my interests go in different directions and often skip about. So, my first book, First Time Solo, was set in the Second World War, and when I was finished with that, I was like, okay, I don't want to write about the Second World War anymore. I want to try something different. So I went back to the 18th century for Selma Hill and did something completely different. It's refreshing. I like that. So yeah, I just keep working away and see what happens.
Good. And I mean, as I say, I've been lucky enough to read the memoir, and I think people will engage with it, because it gives you that real insight into life as not as an outsider, but becoming an insider to an extent in a different culture, in a different country, completely different culture, obviously, from Scotland.
Yeah, hopefully. Thanks for that. Yeah. It's been interesting. Writing a memoir has been difficult, because it's sort of, you never know if anybody's actually going to be interested. All it's doing is basically me talking about me, and I find myself endlessly fascinating, but I have no idea if anyone else ever.
So was your wife the first reader then of the book? Because obviously it's your life is an integral part of hers and vice versa, particularly when you moved to where you're staying now. Yeah,
she wasn't so much. She's not, for the same reason I don't enjoy reading in Japanese that much. She doesn't enjoy reading in English much, because it feels like study. It's kind of hard work. So I ran everything by her, because it's a true story. Her family and her father in particular are big characters in the book, so I had to legally had to run everything past people. But she's reading it just now. She just texted me this morning and said, "I finished the first chapter. It's funny." I'm like, okay, good, great. So, but yeah, she was the first reader of. There's various bits in Japanese where I use the sentences, and she checked all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Now, my first readers, I've got a few friends who are writers.
Yeah, you can trust them for their opinion.
Yeah, and my agent, who is fantastic and can be wonderfully blunt when someone's not good enough.
Which you need.
Exactly. Yeah.
We're on to the fifth and final question of the podcast, and that is either the last book you read or the book that you're currently reading.
Yeah, it's one I just finished, one I've reviewed actually. It's The User's Guide to Make Believe by Jane Alexander. I should disclose I know Jane. She's a friend. We both did the Creative Writing Masters at Glasgow together. But this isn't nepotism. This isn't me just bigging up a friend's book. It's fantastic. It's a really good book. It's her second novel. She published a novel called The Last Treasure Hunt 5 years ago, I think, which is literary fiction. And this new one is kind of speculative science fiction thriller, I guess. And it's fantastic. If anybody likes, this is kind of a lazy comparison, but if anybody likes Black Mirror, this book will be for you. It's absolutely.
You do realise you've been going through comparing things.
I know. I know. Yeah, it's so easy to do, and it is.
I suppose it's to get as you. I think, to be fair, it's you to giving people an idea of roughly pitching it as to where people should be thinking where the book is.
Exactly. It is a convenient way of doing it, but yeah, every time I do it, I sort of cringe inside and go, damn. But it's not. It's in that ballpark, but it's its own thing. It's set slightly in the future. There's technology that allows us, sort of virtual reality technology that allows people to create their own fantasy worlds, whatever you can imagine you experience. And as always in these kind of stories, it's run by a faceless, horrible, bureaucratic capitalist company that turns out to be not the nicest people in the world and doing secret horrible things. So it's one of these David and Goliath stories, one poor woman raging against this big machine, and it's just brilliant. It's captivating, it's gripping, it's a proper thriller in that sense, but it's also got so much heart. There's human relationships at the centre of the novel, and Jane Alexander's brilliant at writing relationships, real vivid relationships that everybody can immediately recognise. And it's just out kind of nowish. In fact, I think tonight, as we record this, there's a book launch for it in Edinburgh.
Because I wonder, and again I've asked various people, just in general terms, but quite specific for you then as a reader and also a reviewer of a book or something, that's a real pressure.
Yeah, it can be. I have a general policy because I write for a newspaper, an actual print newspaper with column inches and ink. I try not to review something I really don't like. Mm-hmm. I don't see the point in wasting limited space in a newspaper telling people not to read something. You can use that space to tell them to read something else instead. So yeah, there's that, but also, I guess I've had people say this to me, that it's hard to separate me from my books, that they'll read them. So my third novel, The Waves Burn Bright, one of the main characters is a woman, and a few of my early readers, a few of my friends read it, and they're like, I didn't realise it was a woman until page 3 because I just heard your voice when I was reading it. I've never really had that with readers. I can read my friend's stuff kind of objectively. I've worked as an editor in a few places, few publishing companies and things, and that kind of objectivity of just going, the writer doesn't matter, I'll focus on this. But then the great part is when you get to the end of a good book, you can turn back to the writer and go, this is amazing, you've done a great job. So
because Chris Dolan, who was on the first podcast and he's hosting your event at I Write, and he always tells me the story of when his first novel came out, and a friend of his at the time, which will tell you everything that's going to happen in the story, was looking to get into book reviewing. So Chris had put a word in with the Herald, and the guy reviewed Chris's book and then absolutely panned it.
Oh God.
So it was the end of our friendship, and I think he was kind of taken aback, and maybe not looking for a kind of sycophantic review, but I thought, in fairness, and he was completely taken aback. So there is that. I mean, the guy was being completely and brutally honest, but
yeah, if you're going to be, if you have to be negative, you have to be negative about something. And I have written quite damning reviews, but you still try to be balanced. Mm-hmm. Even though I may hate something, somebody else will absolutely love it.
How do you feel about reviews of your own books?
Yeah, I want to say I don't read them, but of course I read them. Yeah. Of course I do. Try and find them, and sometimes, if they're good, they're great, and you're happy for the rest of the day. Sometimes they come up with things that I'd never even thought about, and that can be interesting. I've only had one absolute hatchet job of a review, and that was from my first book, and that was destroying. That was awful. It was in the Guardian.
Right.
I was like, oh, I'm in the garden. Oh my God. And that was horrible.
That's tough, especially if it's your first novel, as you say.
Yeah, and it was, I feel, I mean, I suppose every writer who gets a bad review thinks it's unfair, but the things the reviewer picked up on to criticise, I think were pretty unfair. If you don't like the plot or you don't like the characters or something, then fine, criticise that. But yeah, I guess I'm not unbiased in rejecting.
But I like what you were saying earlier on, that idea of, particularly in print newspaper, because space is at a premium, that why would you fill your pages full of things to tell readers, don't read this, don't read that? It should be positive, critical, but in a positive way.
Yeah, there's so many books out there. So I review for the Japan Times, and most of the time we only get 250 words. You can't be critical in 250 words. Once you've explained the plot and said whether it's good or bad, you're done. You're out of words. So if there's only that space, 250 word reviews, why waste it? Why say this is a bad book, ignore it, when there's been 50 other books published that day that could be better?
And you're in, as I mentioned right at the very start, you're here in Glasgow just now, you're on this book tour for the only gaijin in the village. What has been the response so far when you've been doing readings and been at various events?
It's been great. It's the book is mostly sort of funny, humorous. There's a lot of comedy in it. So when I've been reading bits out, I guess it's like a stand-up comedian trying new material. You don't know it's actually funny until people in the room laugh, and that's been happening. People laughing at the right bits. So that's been good. We haven't had many reviews out yet. We're sort of in that period where the book's kind of out, but the reviews aren't yet. So wait and see what the critics think of it. But yeah, so far it's been positive. And
I was telling you before we started recording that I had been reading. There was a section in your book, and I'd been out and I'd moved the car outside, and I came back in, wandering through the house in my shoes, and it made me laugh. I was telling my wife how I just read a bit in your book where, in Japanese households there's always a right at the front door where you would take your shoes off, and people in Japan would be asking you why we would just walk into the house and drag all the dirt behind us. And actually when you read that and you go, I don't know why we do that.
Yeah, it's one of the great things about travel, and particularly about living abroad, is how much it makes you question things you take for granted from where you're from. So I would go to Japan and people would say, well, why do people not take their shoes off when they go inside? And you watch films and they've got their kids are on the bed with their shoes on, or their feet up on the table with their dirty boots on. And I literally have no answer. Why don't we take our shoes off? We've been walking through the mud, walking through whatever, and then you drag it into your house and put it up on your sofa, and there is no reason I can think of. And particularly now, we're recording this in the middle of the coronavirus scare, where everyone's wash your hands, use sanitizer, things like that. And we should be doing that all the time,
Exactly.
The outside can be a dirty place.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad at least you managed to make it over from Japan to Glasgow for this podcast, as well as for promoting your book.
Yeah, I made it over. I don't know if I'll make it back. I might have to stay a bit longer.
Well, listen, we've got the podcast recording now, so I'm happy. So.
Great.
Well, listen, thanks very much, Iain, for joining us. If anybody wants to hear or read of any of Iain's choices, you can go onto my website, www.paulcudahy.com. There's a page for each of the individual guests, so I've put all the book choices there, and also The Only Gaijin in the Village by Polygon Books is out now, so go and buy it because it is a belter of a memoir. But Iain, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to the Read All About It podcast, and I'd love to hear what you thought about it. You can get in touch via Twitter at ReadAllAbout20, on Instagram at ReadAllAboutItPodcast, or you can send an email to readallaboutit@paulcudahy.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, subscribe, leave a review and spread the word. If you haven't enjoyed it, say nothing to anybody. But I do hope you can join me, Paul Cudahy, next time on the Read All About It podcast. And in the meantime, keep reading.